But today, as we always said we would, Jim and I are releasing the consolidated and updated budget impact of Labor's policies that we're taking to the election. This is the earliest any opposition has released budget costings ever. Of course, in 2013, the last time the Liberal Party was in opposition, they released their costings 36 hours before the people went to the polls. Here we are, before the last week starts, releasing our costings. But of course the Liberals released their true policies in the 2014 budget, when they cut health, education, the pension, ABC and SBS, after having given a solemn promise not to do so. Of course, this has been a rigorous process. The combination of working with the Parliamentary Budget Office and our panel of experts in financial accounting and government accounting means we are able to provide a very rigorous process. Jim will talk more about that, and the panel is here today as well, and James McKenzie will briefly outline the work of the panel before we take questions. Because of our policies, Shorten Labor government will deliver a surplus next financial year, the same year as the government, bigger budget surpluses over the forward estimates, 40% larger than the government, a bigger budget surplus each and every year, next year and beyond, including all years over the forward estimates and over the medium term. We'd previously committed to bigger budget surpluses cumulatively. Today we're confirming bigger budget surpluses each and every year under a Shorten Labor government. We'll reach a surplus of 1% of GDP in 2022-23, 4 years earlier than the government is forecasting. That is $21.7 billion surplus in that year. These forecasts take into account all of Labor's policies, both spending and revenue, and also take into account an assumption that a Shorten Labor government will deliver further tax relief when the tax-to-GDP ratio hits 24.3%, the same rate as the Howard government. And I'll just take a moment just to explain that. Just as the previous Labor government's budgets had an assumption, just as the current Liberal government's budgets had an assumption until 2017, we have incorporated an assumption in our forecast to provide a realistic indication of the surpluses under us. It would be unrealistic not to assume tax relief at a certain level. We've assumed that under a Shorten Labor government that we will provide tax relief when the tax-to-GDP ratio hits 24.3%, which is equivalent to that under the Howard government. Now, as Bill and I and Jim have consistently said, when the budget returns to sustainable surplus, that's when tax relief can prudently and sensibly be considered and delivered. I agree with Peter Costello. Tax relief should be delivered budget by budget, term by term, not on the never-never. But the assumption that we've incorporated in these figures means that our forecast surpluses are more realistic. Under the Shorten Labor government, as I said, we'll have bigger budget surpluses over the forward estimates. We will also have bigger budget surpluses over the decade, cumulatively, and each and every year. The red line, of course, recognises the underlying cash balance of the Labor government. The blue lines indicate the PFO projections. Now, these figures importantly incorporate the 24.3% assumption. We can deliver these bigger budget surpluses and the bigger investments on health and education while also assuming tax relief going forward. Now, with that 24.3% assumption, Australia will of course remain a low-taxing country in the lowest third of OECD countries when it comes to the tax-to-GDP ratio, as the next graph will indicate. Australia will remain a low-taxing government under a Shorten Labor government. Just give that one a second. That's the tax-to-GDP ratio in the OECD. Australia remains a low-taxing government under the Shorten Labor government. Now, as you know, we've adopted a proactive approach when it comes to policy of closing down and reforming tax loopholes and concessions which overwhelmingly benefit high-wealth individuals. Australia has a two-class tax system. If you're of means, if your incomes come from a certain place, you've got good accounting advice, you get access to the first-class tax system. If you're a normal pay-as-you-go taxpayer, just the very basic deductions, it's economy class for you. We're reforming the tax system. These reforms raise $154 billion over the next decade. I know there's a lot of figures the government would have you believe. These are the figures, the verified, costed figures of Labor's policy of closing down tax concessions and loopholes. Now, the Liberals will run and have run a dishonest campaign about who's impacted. It's worth just spending a moment running through it. 96% of Australians won't be impacted by the abolition of franking credit refunds. 95% of superannuants won't be affected by our changes to superannuation. 98% of taxpayers won't be affected by our family trust reforms. 99% of taxpayers won't be affected by our reforms to limit the tax deduction for managing your tax affairs. And 100% of people who currently negatively gear will be not impacted because of the grandfathering of our policy. Now, I know it's unusual for the Labor Party to go to an election promising bigger budget surpluses. We can do so not just as a commitment because it's underpinned by these policies. It's hard work of the Labor team identifying the tax concessions, modernising our tax system, making it fairer, making it better. Hence, our promise of bigger budget surpluses is not just a promise, it's underpinned by policy. But it's also important just to spend a moment on the why. Bill Shorten and I and Jim and the team believe in bigger budget surpluses because Australia's economy needs a fighting fund. It needs a buffer. We need to replenish the buffers in case they're ever needed. We need bigger budget surpluses. We get to 1% of GDP more quickly and we maintain the increase in the bigger budget surplus because we believe in it. We believe in defending the AAA credit rating. We believe in reducing our interest bill. We'd rather spend that money on health and education than debt interest. And we believe in providing a bigger buffer going forward. So the contrast is clear. By having budget surpluses, $86 billion bigger than the Liberals over the next 10 years, $17 billion bigger over the forward estimates, we'll pay down debt faster, we'll improve the capacity of the government to respond to changing economic circumstances, and we provide more capability of investing in health and education. The contrast is clear. We are providing a real choice to Australian people, a remedy, not a replica, an alternative, not an echo. But that's what this election is all about. The Liberals have spent the last 6 years fighting amongst themselves. The only thing they've agreed on is an $80 billion tax cut to big business. And we know that that'll be back if they have a majority in the Senate with Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson. We know their policy is to lock in billions of dollars worth of high-income tax cuts, at least $77 billion, probably $89 billion, but they won't tell you. They're being dishonest about it. Here we are accounting for our policies, outlining them in detail. We've done the hard work. We've got the more responsible set of books. We have bigger investments in health and education, bigger budget surpluses, and we're ready for government. We've got the team, the experience, the policies, the program and the rigour to show that we're ready for government. We're ready to serve the Australian people as the government.